So as you can see today, I'm going to be talking about inequality and beliefs, and the kind of belief that, here, let me just use this, that I'll be talking about has mainly to do with fairness, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. I'll be talking about how egalitarian preferences and behaviors are affected by beliefs about justice. That is the economy a meritocracy? If somebody got rich, did they deserve it? Those kinds of beliefs. And I'll be overviewing how these beliefs have been conceptualized in the past. And then I'll introduce a newer focus on what we call target-specific beliefs. So if you think about voters trying to figure out their attitudes about different types of redistributive policies, they may have beliefs specifically about the rich that are important for some policies, specifically about the poor that are important for some policies, or they may have general ideological worldviews. And we're beginning to realize that an ideological worldview is a different type of belief. It may even be a different type of kind of mental process, according to psychologists. So I'll be talking about newer work on these more specific kinds of beliefs. And of course, I'll be commenting as well on the academic and policy relevance of this research. So we've known for quite some time across the disciplines, like sociology, history, economics, political science, that fairness matters in redistributive politics. So this is not the new point of today's talk. I'll be reviewing some of it, but this is old news. People are more opposed to inequality when they believe that it reflects sort of bad luck on the part of the poor, or kind of birthright or good luck on the part of the rich. That makes it feel less fair and makes people kind of want to do something about it. And to the extent that people think that the economy is a meritocracy, then they're more accepting of inequality. Now, pecuniary self-interest matters too. Nobody doubts that either. But it doesn't matter as much as traditional economists thought it would at the outset of this sort of thrust of literature in economics. Other disciplines knew all along that fairness mattered, but economists were a little, they needed to see the data in a different way and kind of took their time to accept that fairness matters as much as it does. So, as I said, I'm an economist, but I want to make it perfectly clear that we're not taking credit for these ideas. The basic idea goes at least as far back, further, but in terms of, a lot of the historical documentation, to Martin Luther. He posted sort of orders on church doors to help the poor if they had labored industriously in their craft, but not necessarily otherwise. So this is the idea of the Protestant work ethic. And more recently, not that recent from our perspective, it's many decades old, but sociologists, psychologists, social psychologists have focused on one principle of justice. There are three major ones. There's give to people according to need, equality, but the one relevant here is equity, the principle of justice known as equity, that what people get from an economic system should be proportional to their inputs into it. So, if you've worked hard and you're rich, according to the equity principle, you deserve that high income or that high wealth. A little more recently, inspired by anthropology and taken up in economics, is the idea of what we call strong reciprocity. So this is the idea that if you think, say, a poor person has worked really hard, tried to make it on their own without relying too much on taxpayer generosity, but nonetheless they failed, then you want to help them out of reciprocity. You're willing to incur a cost to your own, like in terms of paying taxes, to help someone who you think is poor despite their best efforts. On the other hand, if you think that somebody's poor because they were trusting too much that the government would help them and they're taking advantage of taxpayer generosity, then you may feel angry and may oppose policies to help poor people. And so we call it strong reciprocity. The strong part means this is a type of reciprocity where people are willing to incur a cost to vote in a certain way versus, I'm going to help my colleague because I know she'll help me, and we're both doing it out of self-interest. There are lots of reciprocal relationships where we personally gain from them, but we see voters, very wealthy voters, voting to help poor people, or of course also giving charity, where there's a net pecuniary cost to them. So it's a strong form of reciprocity. So I'm going to be talking about research stemming from a variety of different types of measures. The prior literature leading up to sort of my point of departure for today focused on general attitudes about inequality as a whole and beliefs about merit. So these are just examples. These aren't, in a minute I'll show you like literal survey questions. These are just my own wording to give you the flavor of the kinds of things that have been measured. Inequality is a problem that needs to be fixed, would be a general attitude about inequality, rather than a specific view about some part of the distribution of income. Or the government should tax the rich to help the poor, right? Again, it's general because it's sort of thinking about the whole distribution of income as being linked. It would be a system where people would believe that if we tax the rich, that's somehow directly connected to how much the poor are going to get. So that's what I mean by general. And general measures of beliefs are as follows. For example, the United States is a land of opportunity. Anyone who works hard enough can get ahead in life. This is, again, about the whole economy, the whole distribution of income. The idea that we're thinking about causes of income that apply to everyone. Or the economy is a meritocracy. Even, again, it's a kind of an ideological or general belief that the same rules apply to everyone. The common question asked in social surveys is, are beliefs about what does it take to get ahead in life in general for everybody? Is it effort or is it luck in circumstances beyond control? So these are the kinds of measures that have been used for many decades in the literature to try to understand these issues. I'll be talking about what we call target-specific attitudes about inequality, as well as beliefs. So here we simply ask about people's attitudes about subjects who are in different positions in the distribution of income. These are questions that are actually in surveys. So the wording of the first two is not great, but it's from a big social survey data set from the US that is combined with a lot of really useful questions. It was, until we collected our own data, literally the only data set in the world that had the right combinations of questions for this research. And it was how I sort of realized that some of these patterns were important. So the question is, people feel differently about how far a government should go. Here's a phrase which some people believe in and some don't. Do you think our government should or should not redistribute wealth by heavy taxes on the rich? End of story, right? No, nothing about how that money is going to be used or that might be used to help the poor, just should we tax the rich? A different question is, some people feel that the government in Washington, D.C. should make every possible effort to improve the social and economic position of the poor. Others feel that the government should not make any special effort to help the poor because they should help themselves. How do you feel about this? So it's just about the poor, no connection stated necessarily about the rich. Recently, my colleague, Panu Pautvara, and I have had proposed, and it was implemented, questions on the German socioeconomic panel that take a version of these questions, clean them up a little bit, and collect them from Germany in 2014. So different time period, different country, different wording, and we get patterns that are very similar. So it's a nice robustness check. But these are just simply taxes on those with high incomes in Germany should be increased. Financial help to those with low incomes in Germany should be increased. So we'll be correlating and also, controlling for various things, those outcome variables of attitudes about taxing the rich or helping the poor with beliefs that capture people's sense of meritocracy for specific groups. So just in your opinion, if somebody is rich, why is that? Is it, sort of good luck, strong effort, or both? That's one type of question. And the other, just in your opinion, which is more often to blame if a person is poor? Is it lack of effort or circumstances beyond his or her control? I'm also going to be quickly overviewing some experimental data. So this is data from an experiment that I conducted on giving of real money to real life welfare recipients in the United States. And I correlate that actual giving with some of these attitudinal measures, just again, as just to get a better sense of how important and how robust are some of the patterns that I'm going to be showing you. And then the experimental work follows. There's sort of a literature on that. One of the earlier papers was by some experimental economists where they took subjects into a laboratory. These were like university students, gave them $10 and randomly paired them either with the American Red Cross as a recipient or an anonymous other student. And so they knew which type of entity, the other student or the Red Cross that they'd be paired with, and then they were asked to donate any amount of that $10 of their choosing to the recipient. And the students gave about 3 times more to the American Red Cross than to a fellow student. There are, a lot of things vary between the Red Cross and another student. And so there are many possible explanations, but it raised the possibility that maybe they think the Red Cross is a morally worthy cause to give to versus some other anonymous student who's just like you. They can keep their money, you can keep your money. Why should you give to them, right? So it kind of raised the possibility that maybe this moral worthiness matters. And so then I did a series of experiments. So for example, with Erzo Lutmer, we did a large nationally representative dictator game where people had a 10% chance of getting $100 and were asked how much of that would they like to donate to a recipient. And we did a couple of these. In one case, the recipient was a victim of a hurricane. In another experiment, the recipient was a client of a food pantry, so like a charitable. It's a place where they could go and like get soup or get food. So we varied race and found that like race matters through beliefs about worthiness. So in the States, people are more likely to judge African Americans as less hardworking than whites. And so those beliefs about how deserving the recipient was operated through race. So it was sort of and again, this is already known outside of economics. We sort of did it in a different way and, with real money and that kind of thing. And then there's some more experiments here where giving to welfare recipients where, some abuse drugs, some don't, where some had a stronger tie to the workforce and some didn't. And, again, people are more willing to give money if recipients are poor but not using drugs, poor despite having a work history and that kind of thing. So now I'm going to launch into this newer research on target-specific beliefs where, just as we can think about inequality being, summarized by some kind of single number, like a Gini coefficient or a 90-10 ratio, this very general view, we can also, we've seen very detailed research into either the very top earners, or the poor, even sources of income, different types of income. So just as economists can and policymakers can think about income inequality in a more specific way, presumably lay people can also do the same and think about rich people as having a different cause for their wealth than poor people's cause for being poor. Right? The causes of your income don't have to be the same for you as they are for somebody else. And so we simply allow for that and then look for some patterns in the data. So first of all, in the American data, and the results are very similar in the German socioeconomic panel data, over 40% of respondents do not give the same answer to questions about why are the rich rich and why are the poor poor. So the answers there are basically 3 possibilities in these questions: effort, luck, or both. Right? So there's kind of 3 answers they could give, and over 40% of respondents do not give the same answer to questions about why are the rich rich and why are the poor poor. So then the question becomes, is that noise, or does it have policy relevance, right? Do those differences generate differences in the views about inequality and redistribution that we should pay attention to? So for the people, first of all, for the people who do not give the same answer to why are the rich rich and why are the poor poor, there's no association between their beliefs and political ideology, right? And in the U.S., so for example, if I put, if I measure if they're Republican or independents or Democrats, there's no correlation between that and these target-specific beliefs, which makes sense in a way, right? Because that's sort of a general ideological or political position. And I'm measuring here the lack of that, like thinking of the rich as potentially subject to different rules from the poor. So the people who have these different views about the poor from the rich in the American data are men, full-time workers, less educated people, and younger people. They tend to blame the poor more than they credit the rich. And I'm going to say a few things in another slide or two that I think makes that actually really intuitive. It's kind of hard to think about if you try to think about it logically, but there's a real world situation in the US that I think will really just kind of bring it home. What's interesting is it appears, and this is a little, you have to be a little careful how you capture this in the data, but there appears to be a robust and fairly strong effect where those who are poor or middle class, but not the poorest of the poor, have fairly negative views about people on welfare. Right? So like your views about, if you're American, about why are the poor poor, are quite different if you're almost poor or middle class than if you're poor. The poor are much more likely to say the poor are poor because of bad luck. And the almost poor, there are hypotheses out there that they want to distance themselves. So they're more likely to say, oh, well, they're lazy, but I'm not lazy. I'm working. I don't earn very much money. I work at Walmart, but I'm not like that. That's sort of the way people are starting to think about this. So these factors matter because they're all factors that affect beliefs about the poor differently from beliefs about the rich. So what we're starting to see is that there are relatively strong negative views toward the poor among less educated, almost poor or middle class, fully employed men. And these beliefs are not balanced out by especially positive views of the rich. So, in a sense, it's as if they don't want to help the poor. And they're also relatively willing to tax the rich. So you can either think of this as being rational. They're in the middle class, so they're maybe trying to collect resources for themselves. But don't help the poor, help me. I'm a low-wage, low-educated, middle-class male. But I don't necessarily feel particularly sympathetic to the rich either, willing to tax them. Again, help me. I'm a less educated, middle-class, low-wage male. So, and again, in the next slide, I think this will become more intuitive. Okay, so a little bit more about who these people are. I really love qualitative evidence, and there are 3 books that I've read, some recently, some years ago, that give some insight into this problem. The books aren't primarily about this. It might be an entire book, and there might be a sentence or 2 about this in the book. But I think they all give important insights into the patterns that we're trying to understand. So most recently, there's this best-selling book in the States called Hillbilly Elegy, written by a guy whose family had originally come from Appalachia and then migrated to Ohio, to what we now call the Rust Belt. So they migrated to follow these big industrial jobs, and then they were following the rise of manufacturing in the United States. And then as manufacturing fell and the service sector in the United States, employment in the US, as you know, that the problem was approached by allowing a very low wage service sector to expand rapidly. And that's where we're getting job growth from over the decades. So he's writing about this class of people who experienced this sort of movement along with economic history and their social struggles right now. And many of them, he writes, aren't willing to work at Walmart. They would have preferred the good manufacturing jobs that their fathers and grandfathers had. And he writes in there at one point about how many of them have very sort of angry views toward government about welfare. Our welfare program, which is designed to help people who don't, are unemployed and don't have strong ties to the workforce, has been, kind of subject of much political debate, and they just don't like it. If you take that view without understanding target-specific beliefs, you might think that they want small government, or they might also support. They might also support maybe low taxes on the rich, but it's different from that. It's specifically, they don't like it when people in their community are, quote unquote, lazy enough to kind of give up and take welfare. So this is again, it's just a sentence or two in this broader book about the experience of the people from this author's community, but it's data, in my opinion. So this is just a memoir. I mean, I don't mean just a memoir. It's a fascinating book, but it is a memoir. This book here, No Shame in My Game, is an academic book by an anthropologist who did long, fascinating, qualitative interviews of fast food workers in Harlem. This is a few decades ago, and found that these fast food workers in Harlem, so they would have been African American, also had a very similar negative view of people on welfare. These are people who don't have a lot of prospects in life. They think they did, by the way, which is interesting, but they didn't. And yet their neighbors who are on welfare, it's not okay with them. They really didn't like that. The third book to your right is also by an academic, by a sociologist who gave up 4 or 5 years of her life to go, I think, to Louisiana and live with low-income Tea Party supporters, the very kind of right-wing people who, and tried to understand why is it that they support these companies that have just polluted a lot and destroyed their land. In that book, again, it's just a sentence or two, but she refers to the same thing, of those people being really angry at the government for helping welfare recipients. There's a quote in that book that goes something to the effect of, the government's spending money helping these lazy, and there's a race element here, because those welfare recipients that they have in mind most likely were Black, but the government's helping them. People voted in the Obamas. The government is even helping the brown pelican, as a bird that has some special status in environmental or wildlife protection. So they're angry that they're being left behind. These are all people who are not at the very bottom of our society and are angry about the government helping people who are just below. I think that this helps understand some of the patterns that we found in our data. So again, if we go back, what we're finding is that if you are less educated, almost poor or middle class, fully employed and male, you have more negative views about the poor, statistically, on average, than someone with more money than you, like higher income than you, who might be female or college educated, those are the ones that have the biggest effect, actually being college educated and female. And of course, if you're unemployed, that's a whole nother ballgame that has a very strong effect on attitudes. Okay, so that's the upshot. I think there's something going on politically around the industrialized world, I believe, like kind of stepping outside of my own research and just drawing on all the economic history that we all know and a collection of qualitative data, my experimental and with colleagues, our survey data, and what I've read in political science, and just across the disciplines, I think there's something going on in the industrialized world with this not the poorest class, but the former industrial workers, that's politically relevant and is not well understood. And just because they have these negative views to the poor, doesn't mean we can extrapolate from that and infer what their beliefs about the rich might be. That's sort of a take-home message. Okay, so what did the data look like then? So this is a summary of the pattern that we find in social survey data. If you think of this column representing regression analysis or partial correlations between support for government transfers to help the poor or to transfers to the poor, here, sort of one analysis, then a separate analysis of support for taxing the rich. What are the effect of target-specific beliefs about why the poor are poor and target-specific beliefs about why the rich are rich? So beliefs about why the poor are poor have a very strong effect on support for government spending on the poor. And that effect is stronger within equations. It's stronger. The effect of what beliefs about why the poor has a stronger effect on policy preferences for helping the poor than beliefs about why the rich are rich within equations. And across equations, beliefs about why the poor are poor has a stronger effect when we're predicting policy preferences for helping the poor compared to when we're predicting policy preferences for taxing the rich. So that's what these two cells, these diagonal cells mean. When it's a target-specific belief, it has the strongest effect on policy preferences for that group of people. Same for questions about why are the rich rich. This target-specific belief has the strongest effect on policy preferences for taxing the rich, both within this equation and across the equations. And these are statistically significant using, that is to say, the differences across equations here and the differences within equations, or all those differences are statistically significant. This is just another way of presenting the pattern. So on the left panel of this picture, the dependent variable is support for transfers to the poor. This is American data. And the bars are the sizes of regression coefficients. So it's the size of the effect. So this is the coefficient on a belief that the poor are unlucky. It has a very big effect, big positive effect on support for transfers to the poor. And the coefficient on beliefs that the rich are lucky has a smaller effect on beliefs about transfers to the poor. And then over here, the dependent variable was support for taxes on the rich. And so then here, the coefficient on the belief about the rich has a big effect, and the coefficient on the belief about why the poor are poor has a smaller effect. And again, these differences are statistically significant, as well as these differences here. Right? So same pattern that was in the table. This is just coming from the actual regression, showing you the actual kind of magnitude of the correlation coefficients. And this is controlling for the kitchen sink, like everything we have in the data. It's controlling for all the socioeconomic variables that we have access to in that data set. It's just not sensitive to like, it doesn't matter how you treat the standard errors, none of that matters. It's a very kind of robust pattern. So experimental data. So if you remember, I said that I ran an experiment where I gave college students money, and actually I don't know that I mentioned this already. I gave them money, and then I paired them with real welfare recipients from Pittsburgh. This is my university's in Pittsburgh. And I showed them a survey that had been filled out by their welfare recipient that they were paired with. And some showed prior work experience, like having worked full-time for at least a year, and others showed less work experience. And there was also a low information condition for other reasons. And then just measured how much people gave to these real welfare recipients. So it's important for this work, because if it's survey data, people worry about cheap talk, so we're using real money, worry about it being hypothetical. These were real welfare recipients. And I even had an associate dean at Carnegie Mellon write a letter attesting to the fact that this is all real. Like there are real welfare recipients who are really going to get the money. So people really understood that this is really going to happen. A week prior to the experiment, I collected beliefs about why the poor are poor and why the rich are rich. And then we can just see sort of what the effects are of these different kinds of beliefs. So here, this shows you the questions I asked a week prior to the experiment that ex post can be interpreted as target-specific beliefs. So when I did the experiment, I published it for, I did it for a certain reason. I had a hypothesis and I published it for that. At the time, I didn't understand the importance of target-specific beliefs. So now just to be clear, I'm repurposing a prior experimental data with this newer lens and seeing if it fits the new pattern. So one is, which of the following more often explains why a person is poor? Is it circumstances or lack of effort or both? Another one was, these just happened to be there, right? Because I wasn't aware of target-specific beliefs at the time. So I'm working with data that I just happened to collect for other reasons. Another is, most people who don't succeed in life are just plain lazy. So again, this is about failure or poor people. Another question was, people who fail at a job usually have not tried hard enough. Again, it's target-specific in the sense that we're talking about failure. So then I just take a summary measure of these questions and check the correlation with giving to the welfare recipients, where I pooled all the conditions together. And target-specific beliefs about failure, why the poor are poor, have a significant correlation with real gifts of real money in the experiment to real poor people. Then I also happen to have non-target specific beliefs in the same data set collected a week prior to the giving choice. Some of these are which of the following more often explains why a person is rich? Remember, the welfare recipients are poor, so it's not about them. Anyone who's willing to work hard has a chance of succeeding. It's about success. The person who can approach an unpleasant task with enthusiasm is the person who gets ahead. It's about getting ahead, not being poor. If people work hard enough, they're likely to make a good life. There's plenty of opportunity in America today. And I take a summary measure of these questions, and there's no significant correlation with giving in the experiment, giving to poor people. This is just a restatement of the same correlations I just showed you. It's just a regression of the target-specific belief on giving to the poor person and the non-target specific beliefs. And this just shows that when the target-specific belief is in the equation alone, it has a highly significant effect on gifts. When the target-specific belief when the non-target specific belief is alone, it has no effect. And when you put them in together, the results are basically the same. So I'd like to comment a little bit from stuff that's pretty far afield from me. This is none of the stuff I'm about to talk about now comes from my own research, but it comes from talking to psychologists, being at a university that has a lot of psychologists coming through who talk to economists, and they are sort of hypotheses in my mind that help me understand this better. So just want to be clear, this is more about how to make this intuitive and how to map it onto maybe the policy questions that you may be trying to think about. A psychologist once very helpfully told me that people have a very highly developed machinery for thinking very quickly and easily in interpersonal situations. So if you're thinking, oh, why are the poor poor? And maybe you have a vivid image or experience with an actual poor person, it may tap into that machinery and be kind of quick and easy to think about. Similarly, why are the rich rich? That may be more likely to become an interpersonal kind of situation that you're being asked to think about, rather than a question like, what does it take to get ahead in life? Or the US is a land of opportunity. That might be more a question about how the economy functions than a question about a person. And so it's no longer interpersonal. So, it's possible that these beliefs matter so much, partly because they're easier for people to understand. It's possibly a completely different mechanism in our brain that people are using to think about this. And it does seem to be relevant, these target-specific beliefs, both in survey data and in real choices about how to spend money that was just given to you. And so I think, a challenge for all of us who aren't psychologists, I think one thing that's a little unfortunate is a lot of people who think really hard and really seriously about policy don't have a lot of psychology, and possibly, the psychologists aren't, I don't think, that well represented among those of us who are really trying to understand policy. And I think this, this could be important. We maybe need to take this seriously, right? So, okay. So if it's true that there's this highly developed machinery for thinking and judging other people in interpersonal situations, there are a couple of other areas in psychology that kind of link to that and maybe complementary and help us understand this more deeply. One is that there are literatures on what they call prototypes or exemplars, or a literature on something they call categorization theory. So the idea here is, in categorization theory, is that people can understand the world around them in terms of basic categories, and basic categories help people think more easily and think faster. So if you were asked to draw a picture of furniture, this is the classic example. This is not mine, this is from psychology. What would you draw? Draw furniture. How many people can draw furniture? Can anyone draw furniture? Okay, so what would you draw? What's that? Okay, you would draw a specific type of furniture. That's the basic category. You have to resort to a chair, or you said a wardrobe, or a table. Right? Furniture is too abstract. It's not a basic category. Again, this is not my research. I'm just bringing to you what I've heard from psychology. So, it seems reasonable that when it comes to the social world and our need to think about redistributive politics and, what should politicians think when they hear of this suffering former industrial class, how do they understand that? What do they tell them, right? Well, it could be that these general beliefs is the economy of meritocracy, is effort important to life in general, is like furniture. It's just not something we can think about that quickly or that easily. So if this is true, if categorization theory applies to the social world, and psychologists believe that it does, one of the points they make is that they think we do this partly because it helps us think faster. And so in that case, then maybe, this highly speculative, but maybe these target-specific beliefs are faster, or maybe they're also another literature in psychology on levels of construal, lower level of construal, more concrete, rather than a higher, more abstract level of construal. So I think these are some of the literatures and ideas that are probably pretty universal, right? That would apply, I would guess, in Europe as much as they do in the United States. Whereas the specific details, like, back here, in the US, we have various qualitative books pointing out to the same thing I'm finding in the data, which is that it's these almost poor or middle class, less educated, employed men who have particularly strong negative views about the poor. That part, I believe that's happening in the United States. I wouldn't be too surprised if that's also happening in Europe. But that's a little more specific to the society and what was their economic history, and what were the policies in place for many decades that formed beliefs about these separate classes of people. But I think the process, the mental process, where if I'm drawing on the correct psychology, where people are using a quick easy, powerful interpersonal machinery to think about specific classes of people. That part, then, if that's true, that we would expect that to be more universal and not so specific to a particular country. So, to conclude, I see connections between the level of abstraction used, especially by academics, especially my field, about the level. So the correlations between the level of abstraction that we use when we think about inequality and the level of abstraction used by lay people, right? So we can, just as we sometimes want to use summary measures of an entire income distribution, many survey measures try to capture respondents' views about inequality as a whole, like as if it's just one thing that we can summarize with like a 90-10 ratio or a Gini coefficient. And just as academic research has recently focused on specific parts of the distribution of income and even specific sources of income, like income from capital versus income from labor, lay people may also think about specific incomes or social classes, such as the poor, the rich, welfare recipients versus working poor, and in more refined detail. And in particular, views of the second to bottom income classes there seems to be something interesting going on there. So, research on inequality, as you all know, has expanded. There's been this explosion of research, again, not my research, to carefully examine specific segments of the distribution in fine-grained detail. The research presented today is sort of a first step in an analogous direction, trying to acknowledge that we have these important differences in different levels of the distribution of income, or in different kind of ranks, as well as what is the more fine-grained detail on where that income is coming from. In our case, it would be like, is it effort or laziness? But I think that's where we may have a kind of a new batch of insights over the prior research that might help us figure out some of the political puzzles we have today.